we thought that we would begin this conference on lived religion by addressing the actual concept of lived religion. It is indeed a slippery notion whose definition varies slightly according to varying authors. And in order to retrace its origins and differentiate the popular religion of the 1930s from the religion vécue of the French social historians of the 1970s, we all know major figures such as Robert Orsi or David Hall or Meredith Maguire have written at length to refine the concept of lived religion in the 20th century. Yet since the publication of their seminal works, however, lived religion has grown as a theoretical concept, and it has been applied not only to the present or the very recent past, but also to the much more distant practices of centuries past. How does now this sociological framework function when applied to the history of the early modern era? Do we define it today in the same way as Orsi, Hall, or Maguire did 20 years ago? To touch upon these questions and more, we thought we could do no better than to invite members of the HEX Project from the University of Tampere in Finland. HEX stands for History of Experience, and the group, very much like our own Britaix, is composed of three main strands, studying lived experience through different lenses, in the form of lived nation, lived welfare state, and with us today, lived religion. It is our immense pleasure to welcome Raisa, Toivo and Sari Katajala-Peltomaa, who shared with us their wonderful pre-circulated paper. Their abstracts and their biographies are available to you on the Eventbrite page. So without further ado, I think we're all very keen to hear our guests, and please welcome Raisa and Sari.
Thank you.
Thank you. It is a great pleasure to be here and to see so many people interested in lived religion and the early modern history of lived religion. Sari, can we take the first proper slide? Yes. As Laurence just said, we come from the history from a center for the history of experience, and that influences how we talk about lived religion too, because we talk about it in relation to and in the context of a history of experience. And I thought that it might be useful to start with a couple of words of the center itself. You can find more information in the website that you can see the address on the slide. The first thing, we have this center, it is a center of a national funding agency, center of excellence. We have money for 8 years and we have about 30 scholars, 10 of them working on lived religion right now. It might be important to understand that we have shared starting points and aims, which is to develop a modern and analytical and critical version of the history of experience instead of some more anecdotal approaches. And we are using the lived religion and lived nation and lived welfare state approaches for this purpose. But we don't have a ready-made binding definition of experience or the history of experience, or actually even of lived religion, that everybody has to apply. But rather we are in the process of developing these concepts and methodologies, and we have a lot of fun doing it, but we're not always unanimous. Just maybe as advertisements, we have these yearly conferences. Next one will be in next March, and the CFP will be out soon. And we have these visiting fellowships where we arrange people and we also have some small scholarships to come to work with us for a few months. The next application round will be in January. You can find that on the website too. And also, just to say that we will be talking about a lot of high-flying stuff, but we're not just drawing it out from thin air. Much of what we are talking and saying today is based on a book called Histories of Experience in the World of Lived Religion. That will come out next year, open access, but we have, as you all know, these processes are long and they take a very long time, so we have already also moved on from that. Sari.
Yes, thank you. It's very a great opportunity to be here with you and discuss about the religion and about history of experience here. We have worked with lived religion with Raisa together for quite a while now. So here you see some book covers that we have published earlier. I think our first in this field was this lived religion and the long reformation that came out in 2016. And the latest was this lived religion and gender that came out earlier this year. And in between there was this, my demonic book. But as Raisa said, we are working with the theme sort of all the time and hopefully moving forward with it. And the papers we are presenting today, the cases are coming out as more detailed versions in this book that Raisa mentioned, but also some of the material that we are presenting, this kind of theoretical, methodological part, are there in the introduction of this book, but we have already moved forward or are trying to move forward, because one of the aim of HEX is to produce a methodology of history of experiences, how to study past experiences. And we are very happy to hear your comments and opinions on that. But as Lorenz already said in the beginning of this presentation, in this introduction, that there are various sort of ways to see and analyze and understand lived religion. So we thought it's maybe best for us also to start with few words with how we have seen it or how we see it, because I'm sure there are different kind of opinions and approaches among the audience and among us participating here today. So for us, in our previous work and also the ones that is going to come out soon, we think religion, lived religion, is something very dynamic. It's a social process. It's something that people do. It's kind of encapsulated in their in expressions, emotions, rituals, and participation. By this, we do not mean that theology or church as institution is not important. They are there sort of in the background against which this kind of practices are reflected. So we see religion essentially as a performance. It creates a room to maneuver, and it's essentially social in this sense. Also, when it can be individual at the same time, but the kind of social part is very strongly present all the time. And it is sort of, we see the lived religion as core of communal life. And it's a way to create or manifest social positions and identities, etc. So we too are greatly inspired by this US sociologist of religion, Orsi McGuire, and we share a lot of their insights of what is lived religion, especially the idea that people do not adapt the whole religious system, but more kind of selectively bits and pieces, and some practices and others not. And even though they were working with 20th century, I think these kind of ideas are valid also for our work for the late Middle Ages and early modern era. But I think what is also, we have a kind of different approach compared to them. I think it's mainly encapsulated in the idea of intentionality, because for them it seems to be sort of prerequisite the rituals and practices need to be intentional, while we see that part of lived religion is or are these kind of practices and rituals that are not that fully thought through. They can be sort of not unconscious, but some that is also habit and custom and not necessarily pondered that clearly. But as a framework, we also see lived religion as a methodology. For us, it is sort of a way to put certain kind of eyeglasses on when we look at the sources and come up with our results. And by that, we mean that when we focus on these signs and gestures and practices, so it's also a way to access to what people think and also to this kind of mental frameworks of people of the past. It's also a way to connect various levels of society, and here I think the kind of theological background and framework and church as institution is important in our analysis. But also, we think it is also important that all the sources and cases that we analyze, that they are very carefully contextualized. And this kind of, there are geographical and cultural nuances, and they need to be taken account. So lived religion isn't just one big thing. It is very kind of active and all the time changing process, and this needs to be taken account when we are analyzing our cases. And I think we can move there next.
Okay, so a nice narrative for starters. In 1646, a group of women on the outskirts of the parish of Huittinen in southwestern Finland, and it's actually right between those two churches, and it's got about 20 kilometers to either of them. A group of women organized a prayer meeting in order to help a fellow woman in the village who was rapidly losing her eyesight. For this purpose, the women had slaughtered a calf. I'm sorry for the nice calf on the slide, and prepared a meal together with beer, and then they gathered together, they drank the beer, they ate the calf, they read a sequence of prayers holding hands, the 10 Commandments, the Credo, and Our Father 9 times each, and they knelt down and they struck on iron with flint stone. If you look at the story, there's a time sequence going on of how things are experienced. But it's also not just a time-wise story of what happens and what people do. It's also a bodily and material ritual and a bodily and material experience where physical things and spiritual things, thoughts and actions, visual and spatial stuff, sensory stuff comes together, where the food and eating was a way to both personalize and to share the experiences and to tie the experience back into the very everyday social life of the village. There are elements of control here in who is included and what roles are assigned into the people, who gets to prepare the meal, who gets to eat it, who's treated as a potential beggar, as the woman with the rosary bead in the middle. And this was actually not just a prayer meeting. They were said to have used rosaries in a Lutheran setting here. And then there's another layer of control that appears when the matter was discussed later on in the village and reinterpreted. And then a third layer later on when the matter was taken to court as a possible religious superstitious act. And they were thinking whether these women should be punished. And you can follow from various sources in the court records the sort of debate on what gets included, whose side of the story is told, and who controls the end result. But you can also already see in these bodily and narrative elements that this is an interplay between something that needs to be deeply personal and individual and something that needs to be communal and shared. And because the women did it together, there was a group of them who all came up with similar explanations to what was happening, what had happened. They were also able to control the result. So even though they were in court for superstitious action, the event was recorded as a success. The woman who was losing her eyesight experienced a miracle, and her eyesight got better after the almost heretical prayer meeting. Sari.
Okay, now we remain in the Nordic sphere, but we go back in time a couple of centuries to the 1370s. Here you see in these images, you see the church of Vadstena Monastery or Vadstena Abbey, and the red box is the reliquary of Saint Birgitta, which was actually the target of the pilgrims in the case that was pre-circulated. So first, a few quick words about canonization processes, because I'm not sure if you are all familiar with what kind of sources they are. They are actually judicial court records to find out and interrogate people who had experienced a miracle or known the saintly candidate during his or her lifetime for the papal curia to decide whether the person in question was actually a saint, whether the cases were genuine miracles or not. And this kind of type of sources were born during the Middle Ages. Canonization, the official proclamation of sainthood, became a papal privilege during the 13th century. But obviously, the source type has evolved since, especially during the changes of Reformation era. But it's something that this kind of material is still being produced, and this kind of procedure is behind proclamations of saints and sanctity even today. So basically, this kind of material, the papal rulings and canon law was behind it, and so basically, it is comparable from various parts of Europe, and this is what I have done a lot in my previous work. But in practice, all the hearings are different and differ from each other. They are kind of unique. They were carried out in a different way. And Birgitta's canonization hearing is really different from many others. It was not that judicially accurate. Sworn witnesses were not interrogated one by one as the canon law actually demanded and as was practiced in many other canonization processes. So the case is based on sort of synthesis done by local clerics. And undoubtedly, the participants have been interrogated at the shrine once they got there, but it's not direct testimonies that we found in the preserved text. The case is very vivid and very, very colorful. It tells a sort of life story or half-life story of Christina, a peasant girl from Sweden, and she was possessed already early on. She saw a cavalcade of demons in various kind of forms of various kinds of animals, and eventually also as an envious 12-year-old boy who teased her mercilessly. The parents tried to ameliorate the situation, but they tried to resort to local soothsayers, which only made the situation worse. So this kind of things goes on till the adulthood of Christina, and kind of situation intensifies after her wedding when the demon attacks her even more fiercely. And then the newlywed couple, the husband takes the charge and tries to take her, or takes her new wife to the shrine of Birgitta so that she could be recovered and they could start a married life together. And there are a lot of very sort of vivid and colorful details that kind of gives impression of daily life, of the sort of genuine, even authentic experiences and feelings of the participants. The animals, for starters, are such a detail, but also I think a very kind of telling detail is this Christina as a useless trunk, as a tree trunk after the demon has attacked her and made it impossible for her to move her limbs or to do actually anything than just lie there. So when we are analyzing the kind of elements of lived religion, and especially if you are trying to construct an experience here, I think we should be very careful about this sort of any claims of authenticity. Particularly, for example, in this little detail of this useless trunk, Christina's useless trunk, it's not as unique. It's kind of very, not very sympathetic, but I think very kind of telling way to describe the situation. But it's not unique for Christina's case because it is used repeatedly in this in the dossier. So it's more like a convention used by the scribes to describe a situation of this sort. Then there are other minor details that really call for the kind of inner feelings of Christina, like the horrible stench of the demon inside of her. But that again is more likely a hagiographic reformulation to follow Planitza's idea how things were recorded, because it's also even a topos in medieval hagiographic material that sort of the idea of impurity of demons and how it's encapsulated in bad smells and all this kind of similar stuff. We do find details of lived religion here. For example, the idea of researching to a soothsayer and then the whole negotiation, what is wrong. It is also part of religious explanation, as is the attempts for recovery, to resort to a help of a saint and then interact with the saint in a way of pilgrimage, travel to the shrine and offer a body oblation there. But what is, if we move on from lived religion to the idea of what is the actual experience here, I think we can't find sort of authentic inner feelings of Christina in the story because they are fused with convention. I'm not saying that we are not finding anything that is relevant to the actual participant. It's not only clerical rhetoric that comes forth, but I think the kind of idea of convention, for example, of how to kind of conceptualize malign spirits, what do they do, and what do you do then when you are being attacked by one, and where do you seek for remedy? There are already conventions in the medieval world, and so I think the kind of cultural scripts and conventions are present already when the people were negotiating what is happening, what should we do next. And then it's sort of a circle or spiral of conventions, of more sort of theological notions that affected the way the participants understood the situation, and then their response, what to do next, and the way that how it was actually recorded. So I think what we can find here is sort of a result of a negotiation that is the actual experience. The local clergy, Christina and her husband, are sharing the same experience, but it's not the same. They have different kind of opinions and different kind of feelings of it. But I think from this particular case, what we can find is the result of negotiation, that kind of shared understanding, more or less shared understanding what happened and why. So maybe we could continue to kind of more conceptual analysis or our ideas about how to study experiences.
Yes, so experience or lived experience has been a sort of buzzword in a lot of sociological and historical studies for a decade at least. And actually, it's a bit of a lazy buzzword. It's usually used for denoting something that was real, or the experiences of the real people in the past, or how it actually was, instead of how things should have been. The problem with this is, of course, that just because the people were real, or things that happened to them might have been real, or might not have been real, we don't really know when we talk about miracles and stuff, it doesn't mean that those people or what they said about the things was in any way representative of anything else but themselves, and it doesn't mean that they always had equal opportunities of saying what they really felt, or actually even feeling what they didn't have all the freedom of experiencing in the same ways. So there were all sorts of limits and constraints and power biases involved, and a lot of this critique was summarized by Scott and Hunt and other feminist and post-colonial critiques in the 1980s and 90s. So it is obvious that people don't do their experiences alone at all, but experience takes place in an interaction with other people and with other parts of the world, material, physical, as well as social and cultural. And if we look at the historical meanings of the words that correspond to experiences in various languages, we already have a hint of this, because they give a hint to where to think about the concept of experience, to make it more analytical and to acknowledge these caveats about the simpleness or of the reality of experience. Because the early modern dictionaries in English and Latin and Swedish and Finnish and German, experience always appears both as a noun and a verb, and it has the connotation not only of something happening to you as a single occurrence, but of doing things to gain information or knowledge or learning as a skill, of experimenting even, and then making some sort of coherent sense of these singular occurrences or experiments. And there's an emphasis even on a purposeful cognitive process of looking for proof or empirical examples in order to create knowledge and understanding, or to explain the world, as Sari explained in more detail. And now perhaps you can explain the picture.
Yes, I think this is our kind of first step from sort of studying lived religion, studying experiences. And this figure is published in this Lived Religion and Gender book. I think what is important and crucial here, so it is really, it is a triangle, and you can't sort of put it only in one sort of single box if you study religion as experience. What is important, I think, as a concept is that it is a process, and you should really, I think, how we see it is you really should kind of understand the kind of dynamism of it. Of course, it kind of at the same time blurs the boundaries, but yes, I don't think it can be sort of put into one neat category. It is something that is evolving all the time. But just because of that, it is also a way to look, if we think of religion as experience as a method, it gives us new insights how to look, for example, how to connect empirical and theoretical approaches we both start from the idea that kind of firm empiria is very important, but also we strive for more kind of analytical or conceptual analysis in our work, and this is also our attempt in that way. As an approach, religion as experience, it is important also to understand that it is holistic and intersectional, and it's always need to be contextualized. So it's not that we are trying to create sort of one pattern that fits everything. There are elements that are sort of transferable and they can be adapted and utilized in various contexts. But I think this kind of careful contextualization is the key element here too. Maybe we move on to our next step.
Yes, there's another division to the three. And there's also, on the green part of the slide, you can see one definition of experience in history, but I'm not going to read it out because it has two fine words. But instead, I'm going to start explaining the figure. We think that experience can be understood at least in three ways. The first and the most obvious to everybody is the everyday meaning of the word, or the everyday experience, as in a practical contact with and observation of facts or events. An event which leaves an impression on someone, or an act of encountering or undergoing an event or circumstance. So, for example, in the case of the women from Huittinen, it is the simple story of a woman going blind and then her fellow villagers organizing a prayer meeting and her getting better as a result. So this is an everyday experience understood in the everyday meaning of the world. But then there is also a second, a bit more conceptual way, talking about experience as a process. And this level highlights that the experience is not only this immediate encounter or the observation, but more often it is a more or less deliberate effort made to gather these observations and encounters and to explain them in ways that fit not only the worldviews of those doing the encountering themselves, but also those people around them, their communities and their societies and cultures. For example, in the case of Huittinen, this is both the process of how the people themselves made sense of what was happening, both when it was taking place and afterwards, and how they organized and communicated to each other their experience, into making it into a narrative and a performance of words and gestures like kneeling and holding hands or eating, and other bodily actions, but also using places and materials like festive tables and the food and the rosaries. And therefore you also need all kinds of different sources to investigate this. And then there's a third part of it, which appears when sufficiently many people do the sufficiently same kind of things sufficiently often, and it turns into a structure, a social structure that begins to influence what people learn to expect and count on and or despair of, and how they what they expect to happen in the future on the basis of what has happened in the past.
And here on the outer circle, you see these boxes that are, in our view, important themes to study experience in or on all these three levels. And they are not the only ones, of course. There are other kind of thematic approaches to it, but this is actually published or will be published in this forthcoming book. So these are the most important themes for that book, but they do sort of encapsulate, in our view, what is experience. Because well, when I said that, we can't get, especially in medieval material, or I don't think if any written material kind of immediacy of feelings or authenticity, because already in the written material there are conventions present. It does not mean that we want to erase individuals from the study of experience, not at all. I think it's kind of a prerequisite that there is a person or people who are doing the experiencing, and because of that, sort of agentic individual or people acting agentically is important. And its counterpart is a cultural script, which is also part, it kind of is the convention part that kind of guides our way, how we understand certain situations and kind of guides our responses to it. But at the same time, you can see experience is chronologically, it's something that it kind of connects the past encounters and future experiences. It's a sort of link in between them, and also link between individual, even sort of intimate details like one's body or material surroundings, and then the community and sort of interaction and communication within the community. And these are, as I said, important, but not the only elements to study experience. But these are sort of where the things, or how we left things with this Palgrave book. But as we said, we are moving on, and we are hoping to move on and to form a methodology of experience. And maybe we end our presentation with our sort of next step, which is basically more or less only questions at this point. But that is an important part or next step, I think. Would you like to continue, Raisa?
Well, yes, you can. These are themes and questions that have come up in quite a lot of discussions with different people on different papers. You can see the orange thingies are sort of themes that come up with, and some of them are just themes to explore, but some of them are also methodological approaches, and combining those two things in a sensible way is one of the challenges that we are going to face. There's also a lot of talk about collective and versus individual, but I actually think the two other questions are maybe more pertinent even to this collective here in this conference at the moment. So especially when we early modernists and medievalists sort of talk about experience, we get to talk about experiencing things that may have been unreal, and what's the difference between that or imaginary experiences and experiences of things like the witch's Sabbath or miracles and so on, that don't have a very physical manifestation. And then what's the difference between those very real experiences of unreal things or untangible things and then unreal experiences? How do we conceptualize these differences? And the same question is between same experiences and similar experiences. So when people are doing sharing experiences, are they having the same experiences, or do they all have their own and they are just similar enough? And what would that difference mean to different people in different research contexts? Do you still have something to say?
No, I think we have used our time, and
yes,
thank you for listening.
Yeah, we thank you for your time, and we would love to discuss this further.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Raisa and Sari. Thank you. So as I said in the beginning, you're all more than welcome to write your questions in the chat if you wish to do so, or of course to raise your little virtual Zoom hand if you would prefer to ask a question orally. While we wait for people to ask their questions, I would like really to say thank you so much, because I know I've already told you this. I found your pre-circulated paper absolutely fascinating, and it engaged so well with the methodological aspects as well as the case study. 2 case studies that made everything much more specific and much more anchored into reality for us. I really particularly like the way in which your talk took us from lived religion as a concept with the healing ritual from Huitinen, I think.
Yes.
The healing ritual of a group of women to restore the eyesight of one of their community members. And that was really, we could see their lived religion in the way that I personally understand it, that is to say the practice, what they did, their agency, the methods they put together in order to obtain a ritual in which they took part and that made sense to them. Building sense together was important. Moving to perhaps in the case of Christina, something which still continued to have elements of lived religion, with the seeking the help of a soothsayer and things like that, but for which we have much more to go on in order to study experience. And I think there is a tension here, something that I found really intriguing and interesting and stimulating, between experience and lived religion. I'm sure you'll tell us more, and I will perhaps now allow Francesco to, sorry for the verb allow, but I have to distribute, of course, speaking time. Allow Francesco to go and ask his questions, and then it will be Mette.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for all the organizer to organize for organizing this conference, which is really wonderful. And thank you for this really interesting presentation. And I do have a question about the women's meeting to pray for the women going blind. And I was wondering if there is any evidence that the killing of the calf was intended as a sacrifice to God in order to gain help for the woman going blind. And if so, do you have any other evidence or instances of everyday sacrifices as a communal practice to get God's benevolence or help or grace or whatever? Thank you.
Yes. The women talk in court when they are accused of possible superstition. And so they carefully avoid calling it a sacrifice. Mm. They say that they organized a celebrative meal for the prayer meeting. However, we do have a lot of other cases where similar things happen in order to celebrate a certain saint, to bless certain fields, to cure certain illnesses, and they all they very often work around sacrificing a calf or a lamb, and it's important that it's a lamb, and preparing it for a meal. Drinking of specially brewed beer is also very important here, and you have all the elements of sort of sacrificial communion even there. So it is pretty clear that even though they avoid saying it aloud, that's how they understand it, at least in part. There's also a lot of blessing candles and stuff like that.
Okay, thank you. That is really interesting. I might send you an email at some point to ask more about this. Thank you.
Yes, of course.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you for your answer. It's very intriguing. I also have a lot that I would like to follow on with, but perhaps Mette first to ask her question.
Yes, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. It was so exciting, and it's such an amazing project, really, really inspiring and very sort of methodologically subtle. I have a question concerning the relationship between the lived religion and I think you said, Sari, at some point that the whole established church is somewhere in the background, but I'm wondering whether this sort of relationship between lived religion and the established church is that sort of robustly separated, because I'm thinking about the whole exemplum tradition where the established churches were sort of ascribed authority to lived experiences. So this is not a challenge of your concept. It's simply a question whether sort of a strand which has a more of a gradation between lived religion and the established church might be also an aspect.
Thank you. I must have formulated it badly because obviously I did not mean any sort of two-tier system. It was more like to say that it is involved. It is part of how people live their religion, but we kind of shift our focus not in the sort of theories and theological formulations, etc. But they are present there. So clearly, this is very important sort of clarification for this. It is there as well. So yeah.
Yeah, actually, I think the sort of really the interesting question here is not about separating or seeing what is church and what is lived everyday religion, because they can't be separated, but it's the sort of interaction between everyday life and more high-flying ideological ideas that come from various directions, and we see them coming from various directions in our cases. So not only from the established churches, and Sari's established church is different than in my cases, but also from sort of competing religious establishments and so on. Yeah, but excellent question.
Yeah, and if I also may, can I add here quickly that we also, so when I was speaking about this spiral, I also mean that the kind of ideas and practices, they come also from sort of the lived part, from the latest practices, etc., and they affect the church as institution, and theological formulations as well. So it's not only one-way street, but it goes both ways.
Can I ask just a small follow-up? Because I'm completely with you, and I think you did that very, very sophisticatedly. So I'm not sort of challenging your methodology. I'm simply asking about areas in which the established church ascribe authority to lived religion. That would be in hagiography, as you mentioned, but also in the exemplum tradition. So that's actually my real question.
So do you actually ask how it prescribed lived religion, or
No, because I think it does actually. So you have the homiletic tradition of the Middle Ages, where they have all these exempla, where they say, well, here we have an example of somebody who actually experienced something to show a theological point. And I'm just wondering whether it might be interesting to also look at that side of things, the ways in which lived religion is actually, or lived experience is ascribed theological authority.
Actually, yes, and this is what kind of my abstract said that I am doing here, because part of the article and part of what I'm now trying to do is exactly this, how these kind of elements of lived experience are sort of embedded in sermons, and how this kind of minor details of sensory elements, for example, or emotions are they are written in the sermons, and they are preached to the audience to create new experiences. Yet again, something that is actually sort of unreal experience. It's not that anybody has done that, but it's to evoke memories and create new experiences for the audience. So this is, yes, thank you, wonderful question, and it's definitely something that we are looking for in the future.
Yes, it's wonderful, isn't it? How it is all very bi-directional. Sometimes some of it comes from above, if we're thinking in terms of vertical hierarchy. Some of it is prescribed and trickles down into practice, and then some of it is born out of practice, outside that sort of script, if you wish, and is reused and ascribed a form of authority through texts as illustration of certain points, and then trickles back down again. So there is this sort of never-ending movement up and down and up again. It is very flowing sort of movement. We did have a question which was asked by Aude de Mézérac-Zanetti on the chat, and which Anne Page very kindly offered to ask for us.
Yes, Aude had that question for you. Aude has started wondering whether cognitive science or psychology can actually help us when we look at the past. And Aude is wondering whether you have mobilized the work of such scientists, and if you have, how have you approached it? Thank you.
Go ahead.
We have discussed a lot about this, but we two have not personally. So we are still we are thinking it might be useful, but we have not yet done it because we are still not sure how we feel, how well they can be applied to study people that lived several hundred years ago. If there is also this kind of immutable cognitive system, or does it change as well? You know, during in time.
Yeah, there are people in the group who are using cognitive science methods and history of psychology methods. And some of them even work on medieval times, like Saku Pihko. And they are fairly certain that they can be used here. But obviously, they too have caveats, and they're not applying anything directly as it is. But because that's not us, I'm afraid we have to be a bit vague. Sorry.
Not at all. Thank you very much. It really is a fascinating issue, because I mean, how do you apply that framework when the sources you have to go with are so very fragmentary to begin with, and there is no way of knowing, and it was very clear in your own talk as well, about the degree of authenticity. There is something here that really we can never ascertain for sure. Yes, modern methodologies, modern sciences really applied to such distant, fragmentary, often multi-authored sources can be extremely complicated, challenging, but also could prove extremely revealing. Eva, I think, has a question. Thank you, Eva.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Sari and Raisa, back home in Finland. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I was wondering, I study texts and narratives that rely on their credibility is sort of constructed with the help of relying on their author's lived experience of travel. So the traveler, in a way, authenticates or creates truthfulness in these accounts by relying on sensory, emotional experiences and how they are presented. So I was wondering, can you approach, for example, the women of Huittinen from a point of view of narrative? Like, do they employ like a cultural narrative in order to sort of show in the court case, for example, the validity of what they were doing? Like, you said something about the women being together in creating the event or experience. did they, do you notice any sort of cultural scripts or motifs that they were using creatively in that case, for example?
Yes, well, Francesco already pointed out the communion sort of narrative and theme that goes on in this and various other cases. I also, there are other scripts going on at the same time that have to do with their organizing the thing together as a group that enforces people's social statuses and their social roles in the society. So who is the one who receives help and who's the one who organizes things, and who are the sort of working group doing and running around on others for bidding. But they also invoke these scripts of equality, like eating together, like holding hands. And obviously, these sort of bodily sensations are described to make them seem more authentic and seem more personal, and bring them back to the sort of real life. And they are also part of a script that is expected of them in the court, and they are able to make it work. But some other people in other court cases are not as able to make it work. So they get not only accused of or suspected of religious errors, but also convicted of them, unlike these people who were told to go home and not do it again because it was not quite orthodox, but it wasn't bad either because they were successful in it.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I was just thinking of how, example, you could have like a script of a sensory experience, a cultural script of sensory experience that is then evoked as if to sell your own experience and make it more credible in a way, even though it's relying on a cultural narrative or widely shared story, for example, of how you are supposed to present yourself in a certain situation. So in a way that sort of shows a dynamic.
It shows a dynamic, yes, between the individuals and the culture that the script comes from. And there's also another layer of it in the narratives, because once you have the script going on, you don't have to mention all the details. So people sort of fill them in the court afterwards, and the listeners come up with new details and so on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating. More and more details, and the more we get to know, the more we want to ask, really. Natasha also has a question for you.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for this amazing text. I must say I was very giddy reading your examples because they are so vivid and they paint really this picture of how you address this question of experience. And I think the examples you gave really make us think in terms of like how people at that time tried to translate their experience in the sources. So I think especially Christina's like mention of like being stiff as a tree trunk, it gives you that experience of like the stiffness of like this kind of convulsion moment. But of course, it could be translated in a different way if like it would be in a medical source, or like if you need to highlight the demonical side, as you mentioned, like how we reinforce then the certain smells. So like we have like this different layers of translation that we can use, or for instance, the sources explaining how they did this ritual of eating the calf and drinking the beer in a way that they might portray very differently if it wasn't a trial to assess if this was superstitious or not. And my question is, since you are working as a group on this material that has so many layers of translation, and people come from different expertise and different fields of historical study. Do you read those translations differently? How do you negotiate this as a group when you're working with the sources together?
Well, basically, we discuss, and of course it's because we come from different backgrounds, and we are medievalists and early modernists, and then modernists as well. So that's very, you get different perspectives, and that's very good. But of course, because we have worked together with Raisa for a long time, so we already know a bit of each other's material, even though we are not experts in that field. So it kind of it makes things easier at the same time. So I don't know if I have any kind of concrete answer to this, but I think it's very good to be able to work with somebody who works with similar material and kind of shares the ideas of theoretical framework, etc., but yet looks at things from a bit different angles. So it's really kind of cross-fertilizing. So I don't have any answer to that, but yes, I think it's very, very good to be able to do that.
And does it ever happen that perhaps looking at a common source, looking at the same case study, you would come to slightly different interpretations?
Of course. I mean, because it kind of arises from our contexts, and so of course it is that it's something that I can't remember really strong contradictions, but of course emphasis on different kind of elements. But I think that is exactly the kind of merit of it, because then it gives you also new insights. Oh, you can really look at it from this perspective, etc. So yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a lot to be said for group work in that case.
Mm.
Yes, but it also means that it is a process. I actually remember some cases where Sari interpreted a text just as a young girl's anxiety of that arises from her social situation and her growing up and soon getting married. And I thought that actually it seems that there's an element of sexual violence here. And then we talked, and because Sari was the expert on this material and this case and the surroundings of the case and the context of the case, it was her view prevailed. She wasn't ready to think that there was at least enough of suggestions of sexual violence going on in that case, and we arrived to a common conclusion after all, after the initial differences. But yeah, that happens. And it takes time sometimes.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Very interesting insight into the way in which you function. Colin Harris?
Yeah, good morning. Can you hear me? Okay, well, yeah, thank you very much, Raisa and Sari. I enjoyed your talk, and it was nice how you worked together to make it more interesting. You know, each person saying something differently. My head is a little bit spinning with ideas, but one question I have is that I think we need to understand the Finnish context of the 17th century to know where do the ideas come from that those ladies had. At what point was Finland Christianized? How did Lutheranism come into the country in that particular region? Was it happily accepted or was it imposed? And what other similar events happened around that time that led those ladies to be motivated to do what they did? So, of course, we probably are not too aware of Finnish history here. So I don't know if you'll be able to answer my question, but obviously all of that would help us to understand what was in the minds of those ladies that brought them together. What was their motivation?
Okay, I could write a book about these things. but to just give the context to you really quickly, Finland was Christianized slowly during a few centuries, from about 900 to about 1100 or 1300 or something like that. Depends on how you think about what is Christianization, and exactly, how much of it counts, and so on. And as part of the realm of Sweden, it adopted Lutheranism really quickly, theoretically on one go at the beginning, in 1527. But in practice, it took quite a long time for Lutheranism to actually find out what Lutheranism was in general, and also in Sweden and Finland. So it takes another century before they think that they are, they think that they are Lutheran, but they wouldn't think of it in the same way as people in Germany think at that time, or in the same way as we think about Lutheranism today, because those things are very different and they evolve. There are also, by the time of 1646, when the ladies in Huittinen organized their prayer meeting, Sweden had become a great power, so it had spent a lot of time sending soldiers taken from local villages out to Poland and to Germany and to Russia and to Denmark and various places. And some of them had come back from those wars, bringing with them various influences from Russian Orthodoxy, from other northern European forms of Protestantism, from Catholicism. And also there had been a quite strong effort by King John III and Sigismund, who also became the King of Poland, to work out a reconciliation with the Catholic Church. Not to make Sweden Catholic, but to work out a reconciliation. So there had been quite a lot of Catholic Reformation influence going on as well. But at the time, then in 1618, conversion to all other religions except Lutheranism had been made comparable to treason. So actually toying with these different religious influences was at the same time very common, but also potentially quite dangerous. And people had to sort of figure out how to balance these all the time. And that is perhaps what the women in Huittinen were also doing, and their judges and their fellow villagers. So they all were balancing these things out. I have to say, though, that in the case of regular women in regular rural countryside villages, these court cases, they sort of tend to deliberately present matters as superstition rather than as heresy, whereas there would have been elements that could have been made into heresy trials as well, but they just don't want to create that disruption.
Okay. And was it a common occurrence, these types of prayer meetings for people with problems?
Yes, it seems so. There are various cases in the records.
Okay, right. Thank you very much.
It really is truly fascinating to see how, this case illustrates what you said in a much more methodological part of your text, and in your pre-circulated paper as well, where you explain that people generally do not adopt the whole script and the whole prescribed religion. They adopt rather bits and pieces, and then they adapt the rest, and they may go and perhaps cherry pick other elements from other denominations. Now, thank you very much, Raisa, for this sort of digest of the context there, because it changed so much. And we can see really, as I was so struck by the example of these women using a rosary in the context of basically a Lutheran setting. And yet it makes so much sense after what you have explained. And I would imagine, in fact, that this was something that had a lot to do with tradition as well, and the movability of once being Lutheran, but Catholicism still having an impact on everyday life and being acceptable, and then other moments when it was deliberately made illegal. You were very clear about that, and amounted to treason, yet in practice these things do remain. So that was absolutely fascinating. Yes,
it's a mix.
Any other questions? Tessa?
Thank you, Laurence. And apologies again, everyone, that I can't get my video to function at the moment. Thanks so much, Raisa and Sari. I have a question that could be for both of you, but I think it may be more for Sari, following on from what Hannah was saying about the sources and the kind of patterns, the linguistic and narrative patterns they take on. And also, Sari, to pick up your point about experience as something evolving that looks to the past, that knows these stories, and then people change their behavior or behave in certain ways. I'm thinking specifically about Christina's story. The version we heard, the version you described so richly in the paper, comes from official records, isn't that right, in a kind of canonization process. I wondered if you could share with us a bit more of the reception of Christina's story in other places, if that's known of, you know, how widely known was her story? What did other people say about it? Did it reoccur? You said that lots of the elements of her story become almost tropes in other canonization processes. Is there any specific reference to Christina elsewhere in the records, and what kinds of records? I'm sorry, it's a bit of a garbled question. Like Colin, I have many ideas in my head, and I'm trying to streamline them somewhat. But any thoughts you had about those ideas, I'd love to hear. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. The problem with canonization processes is that even though they are very sort of rich glimpses to the witnesses' lives, they're only sort of one glance. There is only one event that they describe. They can be, in other processes, there can be several depositions, each several folios describing what happened that day, what happened before, for example, this sudden recovery, etc. So they are very, very rich and very detailed in that sense. But as a lot of the witnesses are sort of, let's say, ordinary Christians of middling background or even of lower status, they very rarely can be found in other sources. So that is the problem. Even in the canonization processes that were carried out in Italian urban spheres, only very few of the witnesses can be sort of found and in other sources or reconstructed any more specific of their social background. And when we come to the Nordic sphere, there are some members of the nobility testifying in Nordic canonization processes that we know from other sources, but they are not very numerous either, and especially the peasant witnesses, we can't find them in any other sources. So that's all we know of Christina. Obviously, then there is a very rich sort of preaching tradition in Vadstena Abbey, and they used canonization process of Birgitta as a source in their sermons. But I have not found any direct references to Christina's case, not at least thus far. There are references to, for example, demoniacs who were cured at the shrine, but they are sort of, I think it's even quite peculiar that the priest brothers of Vadstena Abbey, they kind of stripped off all the details that you can actually find in the original sources in the canonization processes, and so they are basically an anonymous woman was cured at the shrine from demonic possession, etc. So unfortunately there isn't I think there is not a way to find out more about Christina or many of other witnesses.
Thank you, Sari, for clarifying. That's what I thought, and it made me think that this relates also to Meta's question, of course, about the role of the church institutions, because then in that case, if it weren't for the institutions, we would never have these stories, but also they don't necessarily circulate particularly widely in their own time. So people like Christina, maybe their their local phenomena. So it's hard for us to recapture an oral tradition, of course. We all know that as historians, but here the institution of the church is one of the repositories for the memories in that respect.
Absolutely. And basically, because canonization processes are a form of inquisitio, and then a sort of a renown, a pharma of the event before the interrogation was required. So it means that there was an oral tradition of basically all the miracles that were recorded in the canonization processes, that they were circulating, the narrations of the event were circulating in the community. But obviously there is no way for us to get back to these kind of oral stories. But what we get is this kind of frozen form of them, the way they were told to the commissioners in front of this inquisitorial committee in these hearings. So they are not only sort of, they're all the levels, individual, the communal, and then the church are present in all these cases. You are absolutely right. Without this kind of sort of institution of canonization, a lot would be unknown that is now luckily preserved in these dossiers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tessa, for this really good question, and very interesting it is too. What other questions may we have? We have time perhaps for one very quick one, but if there isn't one, Anne, yes?
Yes, a quick one, perhaps, if it has to be the last one. Thank you very much for that presentation. And as Laurence said earlier on, it was very important to start this conference by reminding everybody what actually lived religion can be, and how we can avoid seeing it only as either popular religion or individual religion, or simply as an opposition between clerical authority and the laity. But going back perhaps on Tessa's questions about texts, I wondered whether those experiences were perhaps gathered, ordered and printed in such a thing as anthologies or collective reposits of experiences, as for instance there are in England in the 17th century narrative of experiences. And I have perhaps a follow-up point about that, which is the distinction that we can make between experience singular and experiences plural, because sometimes I had the impression they could be used interchangeably, one for the other. But I wondered if you had some more thoughts about that, perhaps plural and singular. Thank you.
Yes, the question between plural and singular is something that we have been discussing with our various language editors who have very clear opinions about them. And I think we end up in those discussions because we are conceptualizing something that has been thought of as just a bunch of various things that aren't maybe so clearly defined at all. And that creates a process where language changes. And I think it has to do with the differences between everyday experiences that can be singular events or singular occurrences and so on, and then experience as a process, which is a process of creating and redoing and reassessing those singular things, but it still doesn't quite translate into the noun of experience in English language. There are other languages that may work differently here, and which also separate between well, like Finnish and Swedish and German separate between experience as erfahrung and then experience as Erlebnis, which is something a bit more sort of immediate, maybe a bit more unprocessed, or bit more I don't know what I would say. We did write about this in the paper. You can check there, because my English isn't just good enough here. But so I think that there's a kind of experience that is slowly being conceptualized, and therefore it sort of gets the singular, whereas a lot of people would think that it shouldn't get the singular first. So, okay.
Yeah, I think that is also very kind of part of our attempt in creating this methodology. And I think that's why we use it in singular, when it's more sort of as an analytical concept. Well, it's not sort of clear-cut rule, but as Raisa explained, so when we are talking about these kind of everyday experiences that are not that really sort of thought through or mediated or negotiated, then it's easier, at least sort of in my head, to use it in plural. But when we are talking about experience as an analytical concept and how it is constructed, it's more easily I understand it in singular.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Raisa and Sari, for your presentation. It has been, as you can see, the object of much thought and much exchange, and I'm quite sure we could continue yet further. However, in order to keep to our program and to our schedule, we will bring this session to a close. I would ask people who want to stay on to feel free to do so, but if you want to chat together, etc., this is your opportunity, of course. We will reconvene at past. I hope I haven't forgotten anything. Okay, so we'll see you in about 10 minutes. Thank you very much to all of you.